Miami is a city of glittering skyscrapers, and bustling oceanfront streets. People come here for the sun, the ocean, and the never-ending luxury. But I know that behind the lights lies darkness, a web of power and money that manipulates the law, turning justice into a bargaining chip. I am no stranger to Miami's dark side. I am a freelance journalist, and my work often leads me to stories that people don't want to see. That night I sat in my Brickell apartment, the light from my computer screen shining on my face. My inbox was filled with promotional messages, rejection letters from editors, and a series of uninteresting news stories. I was about to hang up when I stopped. An email with no subject line, no sender. Just a single line of text and an attachment. If you're interested in the truth about HOAs, open this. But be careful, because what's inside could change your life forever. A chill ran down my spine. HOA. I knew the name. Miami's Homeowners Association was notorious for its financial scandals and real estate disputes. I'd heard rumors that the HOA was more than just a property management organization. It was a shadowy force, controlling property values, forcing residents to pay unreasonable fees, and even engaging in more sinister activities like money laundering, bribing officials, and intimidating those who dared to oppose it. I hesitated. My journalistic instincts told me this could be a trap. I'd seen cases where documents like this were bait, a way to lure someone into a dangerous situation. But at the same time, the part of me that craved the truth urged me to click. If this was evidence of HOA malfeasance, I couldn't ignore it. After a few seconds of hesitation, I took a deep breath and opened the file. The screen was immediately flooded with data. Dozens of documents, financial reports, contracts, internal emails, all appeared like a maze of numbers and confidential information. Each page, each line of text was like a knife cutting through my perception of HOA. The numbers did not lie. Millions of dollars flowed through shell companies into anonymous offshore accounts, a sophisticated money laundering ring. I saw secret plans for manipulating real estate prices, where HOAs colluded with investors to push up land prices or turn residential areas into hunting grounds for big players. But what made me shiver the most were some of the emails exchanged between high-ranking HOA figures and government officials. The cold messages, the numbers and terms negotiated as if they were trading a commodity, not the fate of hundreds or thousands of city residents. Some of the conversations even mentioned issues that needed to be solved, with names redacted, but the context was enough for me to understand that not everyone was lucky enough to escape when confronting the HOA. I felt my palms start to sweat. This was more than just a financial scandal. This was a deep-rooted system of corruption with names I had never thought of. I rubbed my face, trying to calm myself. I knew that from the moment I opened this file, I could not go back. Someone had sent me this information, possibly an insider, a traitor in the HOA system. But why? And why me? Outside the window, the city lights were still bright, the streets were still crowded with cars, but I knew with what I had just seen, my world had changed forever. I sat motionless in front of the screen, the cold light of the laptop reflecting off my tense face. The lines on the screen were like cold knives, cutting into my thoughts. My mind was spinning as I scrolled through the series of open documents. The numbers were not meaningless numbers, the names were not random names, and the seemingly innocuous notes contained a terrifying secret that I had not expected. At first, I thought this was just a simple financial scandal, a real estate association abusing its power, raising home prices, imposing unreasonable fees to rip off residents. But the deeper I dug, the darker things became. HOA doesn't just manipulate real estate, It's a shadowy machine that controls a web of corruption, forcing those who dare to oppose it into a corner. I opened a file titled Project Purge, and when I read what was inside, a chill ran down my spine. The list of residents who had filed lawsuits against the HOA, who had protested its policies, or who had simply refused to sell their homes at the HOA's forced sale price was long. Each name was accompanied by a note, handled. Some were marked forced transfer, others were marked resolved, but the worst were the ones labeled missing. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but the evidence was right in front of me. The disappearances were not coincidences, but the direct result of a deliberate plan. I continued to dig through internal emails, and what I found was even more horrifying. Exchanges between HOA leaders and government officials, police, and even some major corporations in which they discussed solutions for troublesome residents. One of the emails had the simple subject line, "Menace to clean up." The message contained just a few lines. "The problem has been resolved. No further trouble." Attached was an attachment containing the profile of a man who, I looked up shortly afterward, had disappeared without a trace 3 years earlier. The system was fueled not only by illegal fees, but also by backroom deals with the government. I saw reams of financial records showing that the HOA had secretly transferred millions of dollars into anonymous accounts, many of them linked to high-ranking city officials. The police, instead of investigating the disappearances, were bribed to nip the cases in the bud. Some complaints never reached court, and some were dismissed with a hasty no foul play. I looked away from the screen, feeling as if I'd been thrown into a bottomless pit. What I'd just read was more than just a scandal. This was an organized crime network where powerful people conspired to manipulate an entire city. I felt like I was holding a ticking time bomb. If I got the slightest bit of slack, I could be the next name on the dealt with list. Outside the window, Miami was still glowing with neon lights. The streets were bustling with cars, the neighborhoods were still crowded as if nothing had happened. But I knew that behind the glitz and glamour was an underground world that operated in the shadows, where people could disappear without a trace. I didn't know who had sent me these documents, or if they were friends or enemies, but one thing was certain. I had entered a war from which there was no turning back. I couldn't sleep that night. The pages were still etched in my mind like indelible marks. The numbers, the names, the unexplained disappearances. It all made me feel like I had opened a door I shouldn't have entered. I sat in the dark, looking out the window of my apartment, where the city lights still flickered as if everything were normal. But I knew that, from the moment I clicked open that file, the world around me would never be the same again. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but an uneasy feeling crept into my every thought. The next morning I decided to leave the apartment. I needed some air, or at least some place other than these 4 walls that were slowly becoming stuffy. I stuffed the USB drive containing the copies of the documents into my jacket pocket and stepped outside. The streets of Miami were as bustling as ever, but something was off. The feeling hit me as soon as I turned onto the street near my usual coffee shop. I realized I was no longer alone. A black SUV was parked across the street, the engine still running, but no one got out. I didn't stop, trying to keep my cool as I continued walking, but as I turned into the shop I felt a gaze on me. I sat down, ordered my usual cup of coffee, but I couldn't smell the coffee, couldn't hear the noise around me. Everything had shrunk, leaving only the man sitting a few tables away. Gray suit, sunglasses. He was scrolling on his phone, but I knew he was watching me. I glanced around the shop. No one I knew. I started to wonder if I was imagining things, but as I stood up to leave, the guy stood up too. I clenched my fist in my pocket where the USB was. A voice in my head told me to leave immediately. I walked faster, blending into the crowd on the sidewalk, but I didn't need to turn around to know I was being followed. The feeling was so strong that I could feel every step behind me, an invisible but heavy presence. I turned down another street, then another, hoping to shake off my pursuer, but just as I felt like I was out of the woods, the phone in my pocket vibrated. Unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, then picked up. "You're going too far." The voice on the other end was deep and cold. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my chest. There was no introduction, no lengthy warning, just a clear statement, as if the person on the other end of the line didn't need to explain anything further. "I don't understand what you're talking about," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. There was a long pause. I could hear the traffic through the phone, as if whoever was talking to me was somewhere out on the street, not far from where I stood. "If you don't understand, let me explain." There was a soft chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Stop before it's too late." The call ended immediately. I stood there, feeling as if all the air had been sucked out of me. This wasn't a normal warning. This was a real threat. I looked around, searching for any sign of the caller, but there was nothing but strangers, going about their lives as if nothing had happened. But I knew that somewhere in the crowd, someone was watching me. I had accidentally touched something they didn't want anyone to touch, and now I was no longer a bystander. I was a target. I left the street as quickly as I could, my steps heavy as if I were treading on invisible mud. The phone in my pocket was still hot from the threatening call, as if the words still echoed in the air. I knew I couldn't go on alone. I had written about scandals before, exposed abusers of power, but never had I felt so clearly in danger. This was no longer a story to be published for public judgment. This was a war against people who would do anything to protect their secrets. I needed an ally, and I knew exactly who I could trust. Jason Carter, an FBI agent I had worked with on a previous investigation. He wasn't the type to be bribed or swayed by power. In fact, if anyone had the guts to take on an organization like the HOA, it was Jason. I scrolled through my contacts, typing a brief message. "We need to meet immediately. Important." It took less than a minute to get a reply. 30 minutes, same location. I turned the car toward the underground parking lot of an abandoned building, a place where we had met before when investigating corruption. There were no cameras, no one around at this hour. When I got there, Jason was standing there, leaning against his car, his sharp eyes scanning me as I approached. I didn't need many words. I pulled a USB drive from my jacket pocket and handed it to him. He didn't ask any questions right away, just plugged it into his laptop and opened the file. I stood there, watching Jason's face as he read through the documents, each email, each financial report, each list of missing persons. His brows furrowed, and I could see the tension in his eyes. Jason wasn't one to be shocked, but what he was reading was definitely more than he had ever encountered. He closed his laptop and stared at me for a long moment. "Do you know what you've just touched?" I nodded, not needing to state the obvious. I'd understood the extent of it the moment I'd discovered the names being dealt with. The disappearances weren't random. The cases weren't closed for lack of evidence. They were shut down in the dark. HOAs don't just manipulate real estate. They manipulate law enforcement, politics, and even the lives of those who dare to oppose them. Jason paused, tapping his fingers on the laptop lid. Then he looked at me, his voice more serious than ever. "We can't handle this the normal way. If these documents are real, then the HOA not only has power, but they also have loyal pawns inside the government. If you're being followed and threatened, then they know you're holding this. And if they know, then you don't have much time left." I knew he was right. I felt it from the moment I got that call. The HOA wasn't just sending a warning, they were testing me to see if I was scared enough to stop, and if I didn't stop, they would do whatever it took to make sure this story never got out. Jason opened his laptop again, copied a portion of the document to his hard drive. He didn't ask where I got the information, didn't question who had sent the anonymous email, because he knew, right now, that didn't matter. What mattered was that we acted, and did it faster than the HOA. I'll check the authenticity of these documents, but I need you to keep quiet. No more posts, no contact with anyone else. We'll do this the right way, or we'll never get a chance to do it again. I looked at him, knowing that from this moment on, I no longer had control over this story. It was out of my hands. But at the same time, I also knew that if anyone could topple HOA, it was Jason. I nodded, clenching my fists, trying to keep my breathing steady. We had just begun a war that I had no idea how it would end. But one thing was certain. HOA was no longer the only one with power in this game, and this time they wouldn't get away with it easily. I left the parking lot with a heavy heart. The USB was gone from my pocket, but that didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, handing it to Jason only confirmed one thing. I was officially in a war with no way out. What he and I had just discussed was more than a plan. It was a battle whose failure could cost more than just my career or reputation, but my life. I returned to my apartment, drew the curtains, double-checked the locks before sitting down at my desk. The files were still open on my computer screen. I stared at them, each line, each number, each email dripping with the coldness of HOA executives. They weren't just corrupt. They weren't just profiting from innocent residents. They were willing to make protesters disappear without a trace. If I were alone in this, I might have given up. But now I am not alone anymore. Jason knew we couldn't rely on law enforcement alone. The HOA had more far-reaching implications than we could have anticipated, and if we simply turned this over to the FBI, there was a chance that the shadowy powers would try to suppress it before the truth had a chance to become public. That was why we needed a two-pronged approach. On the one hand, Jason would get the material into the FBI's official investigative system, and on the other hand, I would release some of the information to the media, ensuring that once the fire was lit, no one could put it out. But that also meant I would have to be a public target. Once the story got out, the HOA would know who was behind it. They wouldn't have to keep a low profile. They would act directly, quickly, and without a trace. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I had gone too far to turn back. I scrolled through my contacts, looking for reporters I trusted. Not everyone in the press was willing to tackle a dangerous story like this, but I knew there were those who were willing to confront the truth, no matter how frightening. I composed an email attaching a few carefully selected documents, enough to get attention, but not enough to completely cover up the whole thing. If I gave away too much information, the shadowy figures might find a way to contain it before it spread. As I pressed send, I knew I had taken my first step into real danger. I looked out the window. The city was still bright with lights, the streets still bustling with traffic. But I felt as if I were standing on an invisible line between two worlds, one of innocent people, unaware of the forces that controlled their lives, and one of those who would wipe out anyone who challenged their authority. Jason texted me to say he'd sent the files to a trusted group of investigators. We couldn't be sure if anyone inside the FBI had been corrupted, but by spreading the information across multiple sources, we could ensure that if one part was stopped, another could continue. We were taking a gamble, but it was the only way to win this war. I shut down my computer and leaned back in my chair. I didn't know when the HOA would react, but I knew one thing for sure. Their response wouldn't be gentle. They'd been silent for too long, running the entire system in the shadows, and I'd just lit a fire they couldn't ignore. The only question was, would I have time to see this fire burn? I knew they wouldn't sit idly by. As soon as I pressed send to the media and received a text message from Jason confirming that the file had been sent to the FBI, I felt an eerie calm descend upon me. It wasn't calm, but rather the feeling of a storm brewing. I closed my laptop, stood up, and walked to the window to look down at the street below. It was still Miami, bright with lights and crowded with cars, but to me, everything was different. I was no longer an outsider, but an official thorn in the HOA's side. I double-checked the locks, closed the blinds, and turned on my phone to check the time. Almost midnight. Part of me told me to leave immediately, but the other part knew that if they wanted to find me, no matter where I ran, it would be useless. I had lit the fire, and now all I could do was wait and see who would be the first to emerge from the darkness. The first noise came softly, almost as if I hadn't been on edge with the alertness that was straining my nerves. Footsteps outside in the hallway, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Another. Then a knock, soft, unhurried, as if the person outside had nothing to hide. I didn't answer, didn't move. A second passed, then two. The knocking grew louder. I took a step back, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. I reached into my pocket, gripping the phone. Just then the doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to unlock it from the outside. I turned, moving quickly toward the desk where I'd kept a small knife, but before I could touch it, there was a loud bang. The door swung open. 3 men entered. They made no attempt to disguise their intentions. All were dressed in dark, no masks, no signs of stealth. This was not a break-in, this was a statement. One of them closed the door while the other 2 advanced on me. I backed away, but the apartment wasn't big enough for me to run. One of them held out his hand, his voice low and firm. "We know what you're holding. Give it to us." I didn't respond, my eyes scanning the room. The computer was still on the desk, the file sent, but if they found the copy, if they searched the phone, they might know where I'd sent it, and if that happened, I'd lose more than the file. I'd lose my only way to stay alive. I clenched my fists, then did the only thing I could do in this situation. I lunged at a nearby bookshelf, slamming it to the floor with a loud bang. In their moment of distraction, I grabbed the nearest chair and threw it at one of the attackers. He backed away reflexively, but the other was faster. They grabbed me, pinning me to the floor. A punch to the stomach left me breathless. I struggled, but their strength was overwhelming. One grabbed me by the collar, pulled me up, and leaned in close. "You don't know what you're touching." His breath was cold, the acrid smell of tobacco wafting into my face. I held back the pain, looking straight into his eyes. I didn't need to ask who they were. I knew. They were HOA. The dirty hands of those who controlled the entire system in the dark. The other began to search the apartment, turning everything upside down, looking for evidence. I had nothing here. Everything had been moved. But they didn't need to know that. They just needed to make sure I had nothing left. But before they could do anything, the phone in my pocket rang. Not a normal ring, but an alarm. I saw the eyes of the man in front of me narrow. Red lights swept across the windows. The engine roared. A sharp voice boomed over the loudspeaker. "FBI, drop your weapons!" The windows shattered, red lasers piercing the darkness. The 3 attackers froze. They were trapped. One of them drew his weapon, but a gunshot rang out outside the door, followed by a rush of footsteps. They didn't have time to run. Agents rushed in, pinning them to the floor before they could fight back. 2 were handcuffed. The third struggled but was quickly pinned headfirst to the cold tile floor. The radio blared, "Target restrained." Jason pulled me up, his eyes intense but saying nothing. I was still dazed, my heart racing. Looking around, the apartment was a mess, glass broken, bookcases toppled, papers strewn across the floor. It had all happened so fast, like a hurricane that swept through in seconds. We had expected the HOA to react, but we hadn't expected them to act so quickly. An agent bent down and opened the phone of one of the three arrested. The contact data popped up, a direct link to the HOA. Without further examination, I knew this was not an isolated act, but a link in the HOA's dirty network. If the FBI hadn't arrived, I would have been next. Jason glanced at me, his voice low. "This isn't over yet." I looked around the apartment. Once a safe haven, now a crime scene. An agent flipped open a drawer and pulled out my hidden USB. Vital evidence that could bring down the entire HOA system. They knew this was not just an attack, but a desperate attempt to silence me. Jason stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "We have enough to launch a full investigation." I took a deep breath, feeling the storm brewing. HOA would not leave us alone. I followed Jason into the hallway where the three attackers were being escorted into an FBI van. One of them looked back, his eyes filled with both anger and fear. He knew there was no escape, but I also knew that the HOA was not just them. There were more powerful people lurking in the shadows. Jason exchanged a quick word with an agent, then turned to me. "You can't stay here anymore." I nodded, knowing that the apartment was no longer safe and I couldn't go back to my old life. The engine roared and the FBI van rolled away, carrying my three attackers into the darkness. But I knew the real battle was just beginning. I sat in the makeshift hotel room Jason had arranged, staring at the television screen. The headlines scrolling across the bottom of the evening news gave me a rare, if momentary, sense of relief. HOA scandal rocks Miami. Executives arrested, corruption and organized crime investigated. On screen, the former HOA leaders now appeared in a different light, cuffed, escorted from the buildings that had once been their domain. The expensive suits could no longer hide their loss of power. Flashbulbs flashed constantly. Reporters surrounded them. A barrage of questions were asked, but no one answered. Some bowed their heads to avoid the cameras. Others tried to appear calm, but I knew they never expected this day. Just a few days ago, the official investigation was launched. The FBI expanded its scope, seizing a series of documents, computers, and transaction records from HOA headquarters and satellite companies. Gradually, the underground network of power was revealed. Secret funds flowing into offshore accounts, shady deals with officials to silence lawsuits. Worse, evidence of the intentional disappearances of those who had dared to confront the HOA was also exposed. The media exploded. Major newspapers were covering the scandal, illegal contracts, secret bribes, a list of mysterious disappearances. My name was not on the list, but I knew I had started it all. As the pieces fell into place, I realized this was not a victory. HOA was not a single organization, but part of a corrupt system of power. Although the ringleaders had been arrested, I was sure there were still people watching in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity. HOA could not have survived this long without government protectors. The battle may have ended, but the real war was far from over. I pulled back the curtains and looked out over Miami. The city was still bright with lights, the streets were still bustling as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew that beneath the glitz and glamour were deadly secrets. How many HOAs were still operating in the shadows? How many continued to manipulate the law? How many innocents would have to be victimized before someone stood up? My phone buzzed, a text from Jason, terse, "It's over. But don't think it's over." I looked at the screen, then put the phone down. I had won, but it was only a small crack in the surface of a world that was darker than I'd ever imagined. And I knew that, sooner or later, that darkness would find me again.